My name is Luis Espinosa, and I'm the Director for the Offices of Evangelization and Catechesis. And last time we talked a little bit about the pastoral care of the sick, of what we are called and asked to do, especially as we try as a church to accompany all our members who are sick, who are shut-ins. And so continuing that idea of pastoral care of the sick, but also looking at bereavement and even the funerals, funeral rites. And so for us in the church, it's important that every parish, every person understand that bereavement is something that could be done at the parish level. A bereavement ministry, or even sometimes what's called grief ministry, is how do we accompany our parishioners, how do we accompany the families, the loved ones who are going through and going to experience loss through a person either having terminally ill diagnosis or a person who has died. How do we accompany, how do we journey with them? And so some of the questions that we want to be able to address is that bereavement. What is it in the church? Who can receive a Christian burial? What are the liturgical books or the book that we use? Looking at how we can celebrate the Christian burial that we call funerals or the funeral rites. And lastly, a little bit about cremation, because that's been one of the hot topics, especially now. And so going and beginning to talk about, again, the pastoral care of the sick. In our parish, we have many of our faithful who help visit the sick, who help make those visits and keeping to the protocols, being careful and being sure that when we take communion to the sick, whether it be done by the priest, by the deacon, by an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion, that we want to make sure that everyone is safe. And so part of that pastoral care of the sick is visits to the sick, but also taking communion to the sick. But that when the person gets to that point where they're getting closer to the end of their life here on earth, they're getting close to ending their journey on earth, is that how do we accompany the families? How do we accompany that sick person? And so last time I talked a little bit about the prayers that we offer for the sick, but we also offer prayers when a person dies, so the prayers for the dead. So then going along the same lines is that whole bereavement ministry of walking and journeying and supporting the family. And so when we talk about how we support the family, is really guiding them and helping them when we plan the funeral liturgy or the funeral rites. And so one of the things that I do want to share with you is that the USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, on their webpage does have a portion set aside for bereavement and funerals. And so to take some of those words from their webpage, they put, because of our belief, not only in the immortality of the soul, but also in the resurrection of the body, the Church professes hope in the face of death and acts with charity in the funeral rites. In previous times, I did mention that one of the corporal works of mercy is to visit the sick. And another one is to bury the dead. And so it's important that we realize that this is an act of charity, an act of love that the church does. Connecting that, knowing that the funeral rites is one of the liturgies. It's not a sacrament, it's one of the liturgies of the church, but it brings to fulfillment, to completion, what we experienced when we were baptized. And so the church as a good mother accompanies us and journeys with us from baptism to death. And so some of the canons that we talk about in Canon Law, we look at Canons 1176 to 1185 to help better understand what are ecclesiastical funerals, but also who are among those that could receive a Christian burial. And so we look at 1176. It says, deceased members of the Christian faithful must be given ecclesiastical funerals according to the norm of the law. So what's the norm of the law? The norm of the law would be is looking into the liturgical books, the liturgical rites, to verify what is it that we should be following. And so in this sense, the church seeks to accompany, to journey, to provide support to the family, to the deceased member. And so in one of those numbers, sub-numbers in 1176 says, the church earnestly recommends that the pious custom of burying the bodies of the deceased be observed. Nevertheless, the church does not prohibit cremation unless it was chosen for reasons contrary to doctrine. So talking about that we do, for many years, it was known that ideally we would have the body present for the funeral rites, for the funeral liturgy. But if for whatever reason that they weren't able to have the body present, then at least the remains would be present, and the adaptations were made. And so looking at even Canon 1183 that talks about who can receive a Christian burial. And so one of the groups that's special and near to me is the group that we have part of the RCIA process, part of the Christian initiation. So what happens to a person who does not get to celebrate baptism, but was in preparation and looking forward to? And so what I mention, I remind everybody, is that those who are not baptized, if they're over the age of 8, over the age of 7, it's making sure that they celebrate the rite of acceptance into the order of catechumens. Because it is by this rite that we clearly manifest that desire of baptism. And so in 1183 of Canon Law, it tells us that catechumens are among the Christian faithful, and it is permissible and it should be celebrated for them, that a Christian burial should be done for catechumens if they die before baptism, because of baptism by desire. And so also even considering and talking about those children who may not have arrived to baptism that were younger. And so looking and verifying, in this case through the pastors, through the bishop, so that we can celebrate a Christian burial for the children who were not baptized. Again, the children being anybody, any child under the age of 7. And so in this discussion, we need to also remember that we do have tradition. We have the Catechism of the Catholic Church that kind of gives us a better understanding of what the Church has taught in regards to Christian funerals and to Christian burial. And so we look at the Catechism numbers 1680 to 1690 that give us a better sense of where the Christian rites, the Christian funerals are part of what the Church does as she celebrates. So we're looking at part 2 of the Catechism. And so after revisiting and reviewing all the sacraments, towards the end it talks about the Christian funerals, burial. And so in a special way in 1686 mentions that liturgical book that we do use in the Church, which is the Order of Christian Funerals, Ordo Exequiarum. So this reminds us that the liturgy has 3 distinct moments, 3 distinct liturgies. And so when we talk about the home, the church, and then finally the cemetery. So when we talk about these 3 moments, these 3 movements, as the church accompanies the deceased, as the church accompanies those who have lost a loved one. And so again, looking at the home as one of those key parts that for us, especially in the United States and in our diocese, we look at how we have the vigil, the funeral, the day before, and even the wake at a funeral home. How we look forward to celebrating possibly at the church, if conditions are favorable, celebrating in the church the funeral liturgy. So looking on that day, whether we do it within the context of a Mass or outside of a Mass, if it's done in the chapel. And then lastly, at the cemetery, what is it that the Church does as she takes the person, be it what remains, either the body or the cremated remains, and to bury in the cemetery. And so that last part of that rite of committal to the ground. And so one of the other things that we want to be able to mention and talk about and share is some of the biblical references that we do use in the Church. Throughout the 3 liturgies that we see, so we first see the liturgy that takes place in the funeral home, the liturgy that takes place possibly in the church or in the chapel, and then lastly at the cemetery, at the gravesite. And so when we look at those biblical references, the Order of Christian Funerals provides us many readings that could be used. So it provides us a reading from the Old Testament, a psalm, a reading from the New Testament and the Gospel, so that we can have distinct readings for each of those moments, for each of those liturgies. And so one of the biblical references that I share is from 2 Maccabees, chapter 12, verse 43 to 46. We also have another reading that could be used from the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. Then we have from the New Testament readings that we could use are from 2 Corinthians, chapter 5, verse 1 and 6 through 10. When we look at the Gospels, looking at John, chapter 11, verses 17 to 27, and the Gospel of John, chapter 14, verses 1 through 6. So these are some of the readings that we tend to use more often when we celebrate Christian funerals. Again, looking at the three distinct moments. We look at the vigil, we look at the funeral liturgy, and then the rite of committal as those three rites that are part of Christian funerals. What I do want to mention before we go more into detail into the liturgical book, the Order of Christian Funerals, I do want to mention that back in 2016, on August 15th, on the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, in 2016, the Vatican issued a document. The Vatican, through one of the departments that we call dicastery, so in this case, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, issued an instruction because there was more and more questions in regards to cremation. And so if we think back, we did not have an adaptation to the cremation rites that was part of our funeral liturgies until 1997, that allowed and permitted us to have an adapted form of the prayers to be used, an adaptation of how we celebrate with the cremated remains. But this instruction, entitled Ad resurgendum cum Christo, talks about looking forward to that resurrection of being united to Christ. And so regarding the burial of the deceased and the conservation of ashes in the case of cremation. And so in this short document, this short instruction reminded us of that praiseworthy, of that tradition that has always been a part of the church, to bury the body, to bury the dead. And then if we decide to go ahead with cremation, that ideally that cremation would possibly take place after the funeral liturgy is celebrated, before the committal, and then the ashes are properly buried, and that the ashes should not be spread out, should not be kept. Instead, the ashes should be also buried, whether it be in a crypt or a mausoleum, or in the ground, but that the ashes be buried. And so just want to make mention of this because it's important that we understand that ideally the process is that we would normally present the body for the celebration of the vigil and the funeral liturgy. And then if a decision is made to bury, to cremate the person and to make sure that we bury the ashes, that's part of our tradition. And so again, remembering that all this stems from human dignity. If we think back at the moment of our baptism, our bodies became temples of the Holy Spirit. And so it's so fitting that we take care of our bodies, and that even after a person dies, that we respect the body. Also remembering that Christ took our form, and that Christ made a promise that we too would resurrect with him. So as we died in baptism, and that we would also die with him, we would also resurrect with him the day of our death. So remembering that we respect the body, we respect that the body should be held at the same dignity even as the person was alive. So respecting the body, respecting the remains of the person. And so briefly, let's look at the Order of Christian Funerals, because it's important that we wrestle with and understand that this is the liturgical book that is appropriate to be used. So that the Order of Christian Funerals has a subtitle of Vigil, Funeral Liturgy, and Rite of Committal. That for us in the United States, for us in the English-speaking world, we have this ritual that was last updated in 1989, and then through the appendix that was given to us was modified and given to us in 1997. That we do have the specific liturgy that happens at the funeral home, which we call the Vigil. You know, a lot of times we do have that experience that we also pray the rosary as part of the devotion of the practices for the deceased one, praying the novena. But it's also important that we remember that the appropriate, or the liturgy that corresponds to the vigil, to the wake, is called the Vigil. That the Vigil takes the form of a liturgy of the word that is celebrated in the funeral home, in the chapel. And that looking forward into the last day of the wake, of the viewing, that we celebrate the funeral liturgy. That in this part of the funeral liturgy, we do have the option of doing two forms. We have the funeral within Mass or the funeral liturgy outside of Mass. So the funeral within Mass is usually only allowed to be done in the church or a chapel, a Catholic chapel, not in the funeral home. That if we do celebrate the funeral in the chapel of the funeral home, then it would be a funeral liturgy outside of Mass. In that, after celebrating this funeral liturgy, then the body is buried through the rite of committal. But what if we don't have the body? What if the person is going to be cremated? That we wait on this last part, on the rite of committal, until after the ashes are returned or presented to the family to be buried. Again, remembering that the proper way to care of the ashes after the person has been cremated is that once the funeral liturgy is celebrated, once the ashes are given to the family, that we bury in the ground. We place it in the crypt or the mausoleum. We bury the ashes as part of completing the Christian funeral, the Christian burial. And so again, many of our churches right now in this time, we're experiencing that we're having, because of COVID, having to wait to be able to celebrate, whether it be the funeral Mass or to celebrate the burial of the ashes, which is the rite of committal. And so I would encourage you to reach out to your parish, to connect and make contact with the funeral directors so that we can all be sure that we understand that the part of the pastoral care of the sick, but then also looking at the pastoral care of the dying, talking about bereavement, is something that is near and dear to the church. How the church, as a loving mother, takes care of all her children, from the minute that they are baptized and brought into the church to the moment of the death, of where we celebrate with great hope and anticipation of the resurrection. So the Christian funerals, the Christian burial is for all of us to be able to experience through the church, through her ministers, through the liturgies that we celebrate. So again, remembering that we have these three liturgies, which is first the Vigil, second the funeral liturgy, and lastly the rite of committal. And so our hope and our expectation is that we will again rise with Christ, and to, as the Eucharistic prayer says, that we know that death is not the end. Death is only the beginning. And we understand when we celebrate that there will be a change. So we're looking forward to eternal life, to be in eternal happiness, eternal beatitude with God and with all the saints and angels in heaven, rejoicing in the heavenly banquet.